everyone. Since we're behind, let's get started. My name is Rella Abernathy. I'm on the board of Beyond Pesticides, and I work for the city of Boulder, Colorado. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is kind of a rehash of what you've heard so far of the science. So we have scientists up here who are doing the research. One more pure, one more applied, and then we have people who are taking the science and putting it into action. So for successful use for successful IPM, or integrated pest management, and restoration of lands, which is one of the things we'll talk about, we really need to be using these ecological principles, and I think that was perfectly illustrated in Scott's talk. Some of the information we're getting from scientists can help us understand like the population dynamics and what's happening with different practices, whether it's mechanical, like the thing with weeds, or pesticides. But it's a lot of common sense, which you'll see in some of the later talks. So Scott's going to be our first speaker, and you just heard his bio, so I'll just speak about it quickly. He works on academic and solutions-oriented work, and he's the founding director of the Institute for Contemporary Evolution with the Department of Entomology at UC Davis. So I'm going to let you talk about your work, since we heard your bio.
So I want to follow on from where I was just a few minutes ago, and some of you will have heard some of this and some not. It's the same graphic I used here, but now this is counterintuitive solutions from evolution. And I pose that for the reasons that I did introduce, which is that ongoing evolution on the planet is a major global change factor. So we're always talking about quantitative changes, and temperatures are going up, more species are being introduced, more of us are getting sick, air is going up, down, but qualitative change through adapting species in all kinds of environments and all kinds of contexts is also coming to define this era, and it's changing the way we need to look at how we interact with other species, community members that we depend on, that depend on us, that impact us. But qualitatively, they're somewhat different than we might have understood a generation ago in their life cycles, or a generation ago in terms of our understanding as a socially dependent, self-educating species. What do the textbooks say that may no longer apply today because we are generating such rapid change? We see things like that are commonplace when we consider adaptive changes in flu viruses that impact our ability to vaccinate ourselves against them. But a lot of other things, from microbes to trees, are evolving quickly. And I think it will be more commonplace than not. It's a great complicating factor, but it is the reality in which we're living. And it also gives us some new and surprising tools that may change our approaches to things. So I'm going to talk about some empirical work by colleagues and some that is by myself plus colleagues. And there are three examples that I'm going to list here. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I just want to give you an idea of what I call conciliatory refuges for evolution. This is for evolution, guiding evolution, rather than haphazardly causing evolution, which is a big part of what we do through our individual actions and collective actions. These are where we're interested in essence, designing what happens. And maybe that's too great a power for any species to give itself, to try to influence the actual evolution in other species. But as I've already been indicating, I think we do it inadvertently, really in our everyday lives. So I'll be talking about, I'll highlight these. In the environmental context, the agricultural or the health context, so it's sort of like food, health, environment, protecting invasive species to foster biological control. In agriculture, nurturing pests to slow resistance. And thirdly, in health, keeping tumors to protect patients. So these are all initiatives in different branches of the newly developing field of applied evolutionary biology. I won't have time to talk about this directly medical one. I'll talk about these two. The agriculture briefly, because that follows up a bit on what I was already talking about earlier, just a few minutes ago. And the environment, I will talk, this is in the realm of pest control, specifically in the context of invasive environmental weeds. So to agriculture, conciliatory agricultural pest management. What I mean by conciliatory, again, is a non-eradication approach, which I think is especially important in situations where we're not going to eradicate the pests. We will just be shooting ourselves in our collective feet. Luckily, we don't have 6 of them like insects. It would be more painful, but never mind. They suffer enough at our hands as it is. So there is a mandated evolutionary resistance management program in the US and in certain other countries for the regulation and for the slowing of evolution to particular crops, genetically modified crops, specifically those that have the endogenously produce the bacterial pesticide from the bacteria Bacillus thuringiensis, which is in essence a bacterial insect predator. It kills insects really effectively and then it reproduces on the spoils. And so that is what has been put in BT cotton, BT corn, BT soybeans, increasingly into other crops as well. And the US EPA regarded this as such an important step to have something that would replace spray pesticides. It's different from glyphosate resistance, where it encourages more pesticide spray. This is one where you use this particular bacterial toxin that we, in essence, live with in the environment all the time, and it becomes constitutive, like we were talking about the seed coats in Michelle's talk earlier today, but this is in the genes themselves, transferred into the plants. The plants then produce it. All right, so because it is constitutive, and these are planted over collectively now more than 1 billion acres, how do you fight? I think it's important to fight the resistance because they think these are special tools for environmental protection is one way to interpret that. There have been correlated with tremendous reductions in the use of spray pesticides, which are much less efficient in reaching the target organisms. So the notion is to require farmers to plant refuges. And what a refuge in this case is some proportion of their planted acreage that has regular non-BT cotton that isn't toxic to the developing pink bollworm babies. And so if here's this says corn, but we're going to call it cotton in this one. So here's your big field of BT cotton. And then in Arizona, they plant 5% non-BT cotton. And what happens in the next generation? What happens is that very, very few babies who grow up from eggs laid in the equally attractive BT, insecticidal cotton, grow to maturity. But a few do. Huge acreages, a few do mature. Whereas right next to it in these other fields, or here you can see stripes of things that look like they've been eaten. They're not producing cotton well. That's a refuge. Here's great cotton production out of the BT cotton. And so the thousands upon thousands of bollworm adults, which arise from the untreated, the normal cotton, are wild type BT susceptible bugs, whereas those that arise from the BT treatments, from the non-refuges, which are rare, have some kind of resistance. What mate will they find? Well, they're not very likely to find a mate coming off of the BT crop because hardly anyone grew up on that, but they will find mates that are of the normal type, that haven't been subjected to and gotten through that strong selection pressure. And as long as the inheritance of the resistance is recessive, so the quote hybrid baby is going to have one recessive allele which gives a resistance, it'll be dominated by the non-susceptible allele. And that has been the case in almost all studied cases so far. Resistance stops at that point in each generation. So what farmers are doing is giving up a proportion of their profit to protect the long-term resource of this susceptibility. So they're stewarding the susceptibility. They're required to do that by law. Compliance varies a lot. Compliance is especially high in areas where it's more straightforward to do it and where there have been recent pest-caused economic crop failure disasters. Is a simplified way to say why it works better in some places than others. And how well it works varies a lot among different countries, but it certainly has slowed evolution. This is the first time a community of members of any species have gotten together to really concertedly try to influence the evolution of a wild species. So it's a whole new endeavor. The degree of cooperation and potentially self-sacrifice, the temptation to cheat, etc., is huge because these pests are, the resistance is contagious because these pests can fly. And so it's a sort of, it's interesting that in the context of a protection of the performance of a genetically modified crop that we can find a new foundation for the sorts of cooperative resource management that we may be required to employ in this and a variety of other contexts to move forward as a large population of humans on this small planet into the future. And the EPA mandates that the industry itself manage these resistance defense programs, the susceptibility stewardship. So it's the industry itself that has had to gain the expertise in how to manage communities of thousands of farmers across millions and millions of acres. So that's intriguing. So that just shows the mixing of the common versus the rare with the rare receptive type. All right, so how many minutes do we think I have? All right, so okay, so in the wildland situation, can evolving interactions among natives and non-natives create solutions? And so when new species are brought into new territories, which we do accidentally and intentionally through, I focus on plants in this case, through horticulture all the time, some of them escape, so to speak, the confines of human oversight and begin reproducing on their own, which in some sense, abundant life could be seen as very joyous, but their impacts on natives, which we tend to feel protective of for economic, aesthetic, ethical reasons, they can suffer depending on the nature of the interaction. And so invasion biology, bush regeneration, weeding, all of those things play into this kind of issue. And there's a general conception that when a species arise, begins to become more common, cover more acreage, that, yeah, maybe we could eradicate it initially, but usually it's too late, and that will be the case for almost every introduced organism that we are ever thinking about. Maybe we could contain it, and especially in large areas, things that aren't small islands or microhabitats, then we have to get onto some kind of management. A very common, relatively speaking, it is really rarely employed with respect to the magnitude of the issues, perhaps, but biological control, where this plant came from East Asia, let's go find what eats it there that obviously isn't here. It has escaped that control, that predator or that pathogen, predator being like a chewing insect often. And so can we go find what likes to eat it and say, hey, there's a great salad bar on our continent now too, go for it. And there are many people working in that area as applied entomologists. They're very, very careful. It's easy to make mistakes, but they work hard not to because of non-target risks. Will they skip on to another closely related native plant and devastate that? And that's happened. Or the cane toad in Australia, people always like to talk about how that was a poor introduction, but that was, getting close to a century ago. The practice is much better. They do try to be very careful, but the complex systems, there's always the risk of making a mistake. So control, rather than long-term management, we'll say, for control, often doesn't happen at all. When biological control is attempted, it can be successful in maybe 10 to 20% of cases. So it's certainly not, it's hard for the Asian insect to adapt to aspects of North America we may not know much about, for example. We don't know all of its needs, even if the food appears to be here. When it works, it's like a magic bullet. And that biological control agent can adapt to changes in the evolving defense system of the target pest. So you have something that can last for ages, potentially. And that's not something we can say about most topical insecticides. But given that we're not addressing most species, we don't have the time, the money, the insight, the eyes, the hands, ultimately, these non-natives will become integrated in some fashion. By that I mean ecological fashion, where they will begin to interact. They'll be targeted or identified as something to rest on, land on, and maybe take a nip out of, as a native or a resident organism. This sort of reminds me of something I might want to eat, but I took a bite and then I never had any kids. But if that happens often enough, ultimately some native organisms find ways to use it. So integration into the environment really implies you're no longer a terraforming invader that's transforming everything. You somehow are part of the party, and part of that means that you're not as abundant as people feared you would be or as you used to be. And so what I'm working with is how to speed that integration. So quickly, I'm talking about something called neoclassical biological control. Ecological integration is inevitable. It might take a few years, it might take decades, it might take centuries, and it's going to be evolutionary, because the things that didn't control it to begin with need to adapt to it. At first it may be an evolutionary trap, but we've documented in my own laboratory cases where the performance increases across generations. It's a lot of free food. Even if you don't do well on it, there isn't much competition for it. So lots of room for natural, accidental experimentation. So can we speed integration by identifying allies, nurturing their adaptation to those targets, and providing ourselves with more and safer options? And the one example that I'm not going to go through in intimate detail, given time considerations, is these balloon vine weeds in the southern hemisphere. One of the worst weeds in Australia is this perennial one. There's a little annual one in the north of Australia. They have little hearts on their seeds. So we'll be looking at both the perennial and the annual. It's a New World vine, should we introduce soapberry bugs, which are the insects that feed on their seeds, from Florida, which will kill most of the seeds? We know that from what the proper pests of the plant do in the New World. But in Australia, there are already some plants related to the balloon vines that have been introduced, and they're Australian soapberry bugs are already there feeding on them. So in the 1920s, when this big balloon vine was brought in, began to spread up north and south from Sydney and Brisbane and inland, look, the native bugs have shifted onto it. But it has this huge balloon of a seed capsule with 3 little seeds inside, and the balloon is what keeps these kinds of bugs from reaching the seeds more effectively in the New World. And so the beak lengths have been getting greater over the years. This just shows beak lengths, their piercing, sucking mouthparts getting longer, their ability to kill the seeds have evolved to be more effective. And so they are developing this capacity of rapid biological control. Now, if you look at the north part of the country, I'm within 20 seconds of stopping. There's that other balloon vine, the annual one. It's been there longer. The bugs have even longer beaks. It's the same species of bug. And there are efforts to eradicate that because it's a little plant. It's easy to find. It's easier to kill. And what is at risk here is the destruction of that evolved biotechnology, so to speak, to overcome the plant's defenses that could be transferred to the eastern area where the bigger vine is more of a problem. And so it may reverse conservation decisions based upon knowledge of these evolutionary dynamics. Thanks.
Okay, so I work all the time with Amy Yarger, who's from Colorado as well, and she works at an invertebrate zoo called the Butterfly Pavilion. She's a horticultural director there. They do all kinds of great work with education outreach, but they also do research all around the world on conservation. And Amy has come up with this amazing project I wanted her to tell you about because it shows how you can, with limited resources in different cities, you can still come up with ways to restore open space properties. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Rella. Can everyone hear me okay? So as Rella mentioned, I work for an organization that promotes the conservation of those animals that we heard earlier are not the most charismatic on the planet, but they are very, very important. And so we launched a project, this is our beginning of our third year, called the Urban Prairies Project, with our surrounding communities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that as it relates to sort of using some of these alternative tools and using the resources that exist in a community to support biodiversity over time in more resilient public lands in an urban and suburban setting. So Butterfly Pavilion is located between Denver and Boulder in Colorado, if any of you have ever been out that way. We're in what's a town called Westminster, but we are adjacent to another town called Broomfield. And between the two communities, they have over 8,000 acres of open space. Many times these are former agricultural lands or grazing lands, so they're dominated by smooth brome. They are often set aside for flood management or utilities, access, things like that. And sometimes also for aesthetic, sort of the views and things, these lands are set aside. In 2014, both communities said that instead of focusing on acquisition of more land, because they had kind of acquired all the land they could acquire, they decided to switch to an ethic of stewardship of these lands. The issue that came about is that both communities have very small open space management departments. So you're talking about just a handful of people responsible for thousands and thousands of acres. And, the lands that are open spaces in these communities are very highly valued. In surveys performed in the residents of these communities, over 90% of people who responded said that they use open space. Now, they might use it because they walk their dogs or they go out with their kids, but we also have a vast majority of these populations who report that one of the reasons they value open space is the ability to see wildlife and to know that these spaces are providing habitat for wildlife. You might notice, since I am an invertebrate zoo person, that I made the bumblebee as big as everybody else. If you ask most residents, the things that they're looking at, the things they're excited by are things like birds, sometimes mammals, lots of coyotes and things like that, but occasionally moose or bears amble through. But as a horticulturist and as a plant-animal interactions person, I understand that in order to have that wildlife diversity that people are saying makes them feel attached and makes them feel like they want to be stewards of these lands, the key to this is making sure that the plant diversity is there to support. As Dr. Carroll mentioned, there is the ability of these animals to adapt over time, but some of our animals, like butterflies, have a very close relationship with the plants that they use in their larval stages. And then there are also some of our native bees do have preferences for some of our native plants. But the key is not only in species diversity, but in structural complexity of a site. If you have, several dozen acres and it's all smooth brome, you are not going to have resources for nesting or for reproduction or for just shelter that you would have if you had some of the plant communities that are a little bit more structurally diverse. So in the past, the way that Westminster and Broomfield really mobilized the community was they would work with community groups like corporations, scout troops, churches, things like that, to go out into the community and work in big groups. And these can be great because you get a lot of excitement, you get a lot of very positive community feeling, but these are also volunteers that don't necessarily have an understanding of what we want planted and maybe what we don't want planted, and they don't have that expertise. And it takes a lot of staff support to work with community groups. And so we wanted a way to grow capacity, not only in the ability to do active restoration on these sites, but also to collect the information that we need to know what are the best decisions for these lands over the long term. When you have 3 people managing 5,000 acres, it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on and how to measure effectiveness over time and to actually observe plant-animal interactions over time. So in early 2016, the City of Westminster, City of Broomfield, and Butterfly Pavilion decided to launch what we call the Urban Prairies Project. And our main goals were to really improve the biodiversity in order to support the sustainability of these lands over time, to come up with better models for how restoration would work in these urban and suburban areas, and then use that to share to other communities in our region who face the same challenges we do. And then finally, to really be ambassadors to the community, these people who have reported they care about open space, looping them more into the conversation and into the work of restoring these lands. So when we started, we were partnering with the Denver Botanic Gardens as well, the Broomfield Open Space Foundation. We also worked with a great National Park Service program called the Rivers Trails Conservation Assistance Grant. And so we received a lot of consultation from the National Park Service. So if any of you are in similar sorts of organizations or situations, that might be something you look into. So one of the ways in which we first decided to grow capacity for this kind of work is to create what we call a Restoration Master Volunteer Program. And what this does is this is a program that requires 50 hours of training in 1 year. Part of that training is field training, and part of that training is classroom training. These volunteers learn everything from native plants, native wildlife, identification of non-native species as well. They learn how to talk to the public and how to educate. They learn how to be crew leaders. They learn how to create restoration plans and how to monitor open space, species found on open space. So, and what we get in return are people who can act as assistant crew leaders and work with these groups from the community. We also, one of their favorite things to do, and the thing that we really need the most, is they are our eyes on these open space. They perform everything from soil health monitoring to monitoring of dragonflies and damselflies, pollinators. We do bio-blitzes, things like that. So they, in effect, become citizen scientists, getting the information that these open space departments are too stretched to collect themselves. And then they go out into the public and get people excited and get people more involved in their local natural areas. So some of the things that have come out of this partnership already, as I mentioned, we're in our third year. We just began our third year. So the things that we do as a group, as a collaborative group, is we look at different sites every year to launch new restoration plans. These restoration plans look at the use of the site, they look at the abiotic and biotic factors at the site, and the long-term expectations of what that site can support, understanding that things are changing very fast, both because of different species coming in, but also because of climate change and things like that. And these plans are updated each year because of the data that our open space restoration master volunteers collect for us. And then those restoration plans are put into effect with the partners, and not only looking at different tools in our toolbox, whether that's using goats or using fire or using mowing or other techniques to kind of create these plant communities that can support the widest range of the wildlife and these urban and suburban sites. We also create seed reservoirs so that we have access to native species that maybe would be harder to have otherwise. And then we perform bio-blitzes and go out and do monitoring, and that data goes back into refreshing our restoration plans every year. One of the most exciting things, of course, is working with humans, because humans can be a challenge, as we've heard in some of the talks, but they're also an incredible resource. And so we work with local schools, other organizations like Wildlands Restoration Volunteers. We do events like Earth Day and National Trails Day to let people know about exactly what's going on in their open space. It should be completely transparent to anyone who uses an open space how that land is being managed, so that they can either get involved, or if they have questions, they can bring it to open space staff. Most of our funding is through grants. So we work with different organizations to support this program as well. So in 2018, we are growing fast. So we identified in our next set of restoration plans over 25 acres. It's probably closer to 40 acres for this year. And then by the end of the year, we'll probably have an additional 50 acres because we're expanding into other communities in our area. We will train at least 10 additional restoration master volunteers. We offer the trainings 3 times a year. We've already trained 8 for this year, so I know it's going to be a lot more than 10, but that 10 was our goal. We want to recruit additional supporters to make this program even more effective, and we're going to be creating a best practices manual that we can share with other communities that have the same challenges as ours. And then finally, evaluation is key. So it's one thing to go out and do a big restoration project, and then you step away and ignore it, and then you don't really see how effective you are. So if anybody here is in the same situation where you're working for a nonprofit and you want to do this kind of work out in the community, one of the things that has been most valuable for Urban Prairies is that idea of working with other groups and really in a spirit of partnership, being able to grow the capacity of things that seem almost impossible at the outset. Being really smart about how you work with partners like high schools. What are the best ways to work with them? How do you make sure that they are stewards in the long term, that it's not just a one-off and you're just out there in the on an open space doing hard manual labor and then you don't touch base with them again. So really considering your best practices in terms of creating and maintaining partnerships. So open space is really important to quality of life in Colorado and other places as well. We know that people are more likely to exercise outdoors when they have healthy open spaces, that they actually are more likely to vote and be stewards of their environment. And so we want to start at a young age. And so getting these programs off has been incredibly inspiring, just to see how many people actually feel the same way we do. And I'm going to close with just sort of a personal story that relates to open space in these urban and suburban areas when they're so disturbed and there's so much work to be done in terms of making it viable wildlife habitat. So there is a patch of Big Dry Creek open space that's adjacent to Butterfly Pavilion where I work. And because it is just surrounded by urbanity, I was walking down the trail and I saw this scattering of white. And my first thought was, there's a trash bag, it exploded, there's garbage all over the place, I'm gonna have to go and pick it up. But what it was this crown leaf evening primrose that had just erupted overnight. These blossoms are incredibly ephemeral. They last 3 days, if that, and then they're gone. So to be able to see that was so inspiring to me. That's something I would like anyone who lives in an urban and suburban area to have, that access to nature and that sense of place that these natural areas can provide. But it does fall on us to do the work in order for them to really provide habitat for wildlife. So that's all I have. Thank you.
So next is James Nieh, who you heard just earlier in the plenary session, who's a professor at UC San Diego in the Biological Sciences Division and is a Royal Fellow of the elected Fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. And James works on evolution of communication in social bees and factors that influence honeybee health. So
thank you.
Take it away.
Well, thanks guys for coming, and I'm going to be expanding upon what I mentioned in the plenary session, which is our work on a new pesticide called flupyridiferone. So, as I mentioned in the plenary, honeybees are important because they are widely available and can be used as bioindicators of the health of other insects. And interestingly enough, this ties with my other research interest. Honeybees actually have a language where they can tell other bees where to go to find food. We are now able to read this language thanks to the work of Nobel laureates like Carl von Frisch, and we actually now can use this information, and there are projects underway where people can look at the hive, they can measure the contaminants that bees are bringing back on their bodies, and then they can map where the bees were going. So this is just one illustration of the power of bees. Now, as we've heard, the resistance has been growing to the different compounds that we provide to control pests. And this resistance to the neonicotinoids has led Bayer Corporation to develop a new product called flupyridiferone, or Savanto. And like the neonicotinoids, it is an agonist of the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, which originally was targeted by nicotine, which plants evolved to kill the pests that were attacking them. But the benefit of the neonicotinoids is that they weren't good at targeting our personal nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, just those of insects. So Flupidiferone is not a neonicotinoid, but it does target the same receptor. And it's systemic, meaning that it can be absorbed in the tissues of the plant and then expressed throughout. It's actually modeled after a natural product, and I think this shows the sort of the power that modern science has come to. This was a product that was known for some time, but they were able to chemically modify it to make it much more potent. So this is flupyridiferone, and this is imidacloprid. Now, because it's relatively new, it is still effective against insects, especially those that are resistant to some of the neonicotinoids. And it apparently, according to Bayer Corporation, has favorable honeybee safety. It's not supposed to be very toxic to honeybees. And in fact, if you look at these in terms of 3 to 15 micrograms, this is actually very different because normally the neonicotinoids are toxic at nanogram levels. Okay, so this requires 1,000 times more of the product. But what it also means is that much more of the product is therefore needed to kill insects. Now, this is just some of the marketing from Bayer Science, and it claims it has no adverse effects on honeybees and bumblebees. So part of our research is to try and test this. And as I mentioned earlier, flupyridiferone is used on many different kinds of crops. And in fact, I'm sorry you can't read this, but I just recently went through and downloaded every single crop that it has now been approved for, and you can see it's a very long list. Almost anything you can think of is here. And these are the countries in which it's currently on sale, so all these dark purple places, and then coming soon to a country near you, these light violet places. And as you can see, it basically is posed to become the new generation of neonicotinoid for sale and use on everything and everywhere. So what is it about the neonicotinoids? I wanted to first look at how these affect bees. So there's a wide variety of neural effects, and I'm just going to quickly go through some of them. So it affects bee foraging. We now know that these things can harm the ability of bees to go out in their environment and collect food, which ironically also affects their ability to pollinate, and that's an important function that they have. Their ability to return home, they can become disoriented and be unable to fly back to their nest. This has been suggested to be one reason why we had this strange colony collapse phenomenon of empty colonies. It affects their ability to navigate. And it changes their nectar preferences. It turns out that it can be somehow addictive or intoxicating in the sense that although they apparently can't taste it, they have a preference for nectar that has this drug, these neonicotinoids in it, over pure nectar. It actually changes their preference for sugar. So what we found in our study is that it shifts their preference so that bees that would normally feed on lower concentration nectar are now specializing only on higher concentration nectar, therefore bypassing some of the good nutrition that's out there in the environment. It affects their survival, their ability to locomote, to walk around on flowers or inside the nest, and it affects their ability to learn odors. Bees need to learn floral odors in order to remember and find where they found rewarding food, especially as they're searching for new patches of rewarding food. And it affects their flight ability. So the blue font are the 4 things that I'm focusing on. So one is survival and synergy, and this is the work of Simone Tosi, a postdoc in my lab. And this was a paper that recently came out, where basically we found something which may not be too surprising, but this was the first demonstration, that if you have an animal that is receiving poor nutrition and it's exposed to pesticides, the effects of those combined factors of being basically weakened nutritionally is much worse than either of those alone. And so these graphs, and I think the thing to focus on basically is the red line. So this is the combined observed effect here. And we'll just focus on this one in terms of mortality, the percentage of the bees that died when exposed to different neonicotinoids. The orange line is what you would expect if you just summed up nutritional stress and pesticide stress. But you can see that here the red line is much higher than the orange line. And that's true in most of these different cases, in which we basically have different diets where they have unlimited access to sugar, but unlimited access to sugar, but intermediate, poor, or rich diets. Now, the other thing that we've looked at is whether or not there is a synergistic effect, which is similar to this, but between pesticides and fungicides, which are also chemicals that are applied and are known to have an effect because they actually can inhibit a receptor in insects that pumps out the toxin. So it reduces their ability to cope with these toxins. And so first I wanted to mention that we're using field realistic doses of the pesticide, and that these field realistic doses, and we're now focusing on the Savanto, the new pesticides, alter bee responses depending upon when they're exposed to it. So it turns out that bees during the winter and the spring are more resistant to the pesticide. You need a higher dose to kill 50% of the bees than in the summer. But what's interesting here is that when we combine this pesticide in the summer with the fungicide, they're much more susceptible. At even lower doses, they now will die. So the synergistic effects, I should mention, are also based upon field realistic doses of the fungicide that bees might be expected to experience. And here again, we have the same thing where we have the red line and the orange line. And what these arrows are showing is the synergistic effect, that the combined effect of being exposed to Savanto, which remember, again, is supposed to be safe, plus being exposed to a fungicide is much worse than you would expect. And this is when they are both exposed to realistic levels that they could encounter when they're foraging. Now, I think influencing policy is obviously a really important thing, and in Europe they've shown to be much more responsive, at least with regulation of the neonicotinoids. So we embarked on a study in which we actually have 8 different countries, laboratories that are involved. So it'll be harder for the company to argue that the results were based purely upon an accident in one given lab. And we hope also to catch the attention of these 8 different countries in which flupyridiferone is now considered to be safe and available for sale. So the United States, Germany, Italy, France, Austria, Switzerland, and Belgium. And I'll just summarize the results of this, which is it's actually not as safe as you would think. So at field realistic levels, it reduces the survival of honeybees. And this was the consensus of all of these laboratories in all of these 8 different countries, following the same protocols. Right. So the question is flupyridiferone less toxic? It is less toxic, but that means that they're actually using much more to control the pest insects. Okay, and the reason, I should have mentioned it, is that it's less toxic because it binds with a lesser efficiency to the receptor than the neonicotinoids. But I guess you could call it the neonicotinoid because it affects the same receptor. It is not a neonicotinoid, so it circumvents the law on it.
So it is not non-toxic.
Correct, yes. And survival at realistic doses. Okay, I also wanted to mention that a lot of the work in our lab is based upon abnormal behaviors and looking at behaviors of bees. So we have bees that are affected, that are walking around in this cramped body posture, or that are near death where they're basically upside down in their container and can't walk. And what we find is that flupyridiferone also increases abnormal behaviors at field realistic doses. Okay. So I wanted to mention our work on flight, and this is the work of Linda Tong, a master's student in our lab. And what we found is, and I don't have time to show you the video, but if you remember from the plenary, we have bees flying around here and we expose them to different levels of flupyridiferone and we test their ability to fly. And I want to mention first that in San Diego and in warmer areas like this, our honeybee colonies can actually forage the year round. And this is relevant because we found a stronger effect in winter. So what we found here in winter is that at a 33% sugar diet, in comparison to no pesticide to pesticide, that fewer bees successfully flew. So they were less able to get food, which again shows that it had a detrimental effect to them in the winter. So the conclusions are that flupyridiferone is more toxic in the summer versus the spring, more toxic to foragers versus in-hive bees, and it has synergistic effects with the fungicide. In this case, we use propiconazole. It reduced survival and increased abnormal behaviors at field realistic levels of 4 ppm. And by the way, this came out of the EPA study, which was a massive conglomeration of multiple studies that were funded by Bayer Corporation to demonstrate the safety of their product. And it increased trembling, rolling, jumping, falling, and other erratic behavioral motions in the bees. In addition, it decreased the ability of these bees to fly in winter as compared to summer. So, sorry, this should say in winter as compared to summer, especially in combination with lower levels of nutrition. And so this emphasizes the importance of nutrition in combination with these other factors. So I guess what are the recommendations? We're in communication and we're scheduled for our annual discussion with the EPA in June to discuss our most recent findings. But we obviously think that further studies are warranted, that the conjunction of this new compound and other bee stressors should be implemented, and that evaluation of flu levels in crops and colonies are needed as this becomes more widely used. Now, what's interesting is that the EPA guidelines and also those of EFSA, the European version of this, are basically written to look at very simple things. What is going to kill the bee? But they aren't necessarily looking at more complex things like how does it affect cognition, the ability of bees to learn, the ability of bees to fly, whether they can walk normally inside the colony. And so we are arguing, along with other scientists, that they really need to look at this because it is important that bees need to fly, that they need to walk, that they should not have strange tremors as they're moving around inside the colony. So as I mentioned earlier, what are the solutions? Well, we can reduce and use only when necessary, and that's also true when we talk about city maintenance, because we were approached by the city of Encinitas, who asked us, what can you recommend? And my response was, well, what are you willing to tolerate in terms of your trees not dying, but maybe not looking as pretty as you might like? Because maybe there's a solution there where the citizens might think, well, this tree is showing some yellow spots, it doesn't look as nice, but at least I realize it's not as toxic. Obviously, integrated pest management, which was mentioned earlier, is very important. Organic approaches, encouraging bee health and diversity, encouraging native plant mixes in our garden. So there's a lot we can do actually as homeowners as well, in addition to reducing our use of pesticides as home. And then in agriculture, the idea of hedgerows, which is related to the idea that you talked about earlier, that we really need to have a biozone in which we have things at a more natural level. And this provides refuge for insects such as bees and pollinators. So to learn more, I recommend that you can check out my website. You can just Google Nieh Lab UCSD. And then we also have multiple other channels. So there's a Facebook group called The Teaching Bee. We have a YouTube channel, The Teaching Bee. And if you're interested in that video, you can actually watch it on YouTube. And then we also have a Twitter account. And so in conclusion, I wanted to thank the many people involved. This is Dr. Tosi, who was working on the pesticides. Heather is working on the effects of pesticides and bee cognition, and the many different students in my lab who have conducted this research. This research on flupyridiferone was supported by the Avaz Foundation, which now has a push to try to influence policy-making decisions on the regulations of pesticides, and they kindly funded our research because we felt that this was a pesticide. Thank you very much.
Okay, so our last speaker is Rhiannon Bailard, who is the director of the Center for Sustainability at Pepperdine University. And they're doing some really great work. And you're speaking twice, right? Because you're talking about the turf program and the RAP program. So come to the other workshop that Rhiannon's in to learn about what's happening on the ground and applying these principles that the scientists are telling us about. So I'll let you talk about your program.
Great. Thanks so much, Rella. Hi, everyone. My name is Rhiannon Bailard, and I'm with Pepperdine University. And one of the first things that you're going to notice, as opposed to the rest of my panelists, is I'm much more a practitioner and a layperson and really a student of all of this. So it's just been such a thrill to be here and to hear from all of you and the rest of the presentations today. So what I'm going to be talking about are the use of rodenticides, specifically Pepperdine's program. Oh, thanks so much. Pepperdine's program to ban the use of rodenticides on our campus and how that resulted in a further evolution of our IPM strategies at the university. So the first thing I'm going to start with here is actually a picture of our Earth Day. And the reason that I'm starting with this is because at Earth Day 2014, we actually banned the use of all rodenticides, all of them, anticoagulants, non-anticoagulants. But just a year prior, and this is actually a picture of a year prior, in April of 2013, I had no idea that rodenticides were an issue at all. That certainly was not something that was high up on my priority list until Keon Schulman, who's in the audience here today with Poison Free Malibu, came up to me and said, "Hey, great work. This is so fantastic. Love being at your Earth Day. Love what you guys are doing with Reclaim Water. But by the way, you've got some bait boxes around, and do you know about the impacts of rat poisons?" And one thing I want to talk about before I get into, the issues with rat poisons and then what our program has been is that I was asked to speak from a practitioner's perspective about ways in which people can be effective. And Keon was incredibly effective because she came at me not from a place of critique, not from a place of judgment or attack, but from a place of education, collaboration, and participation. Really, let's do this together. I want to be of service. How can we come up with a solution? And so that I just want to commend her, and we've had an amazing partnership ever since. So with that, Keon asked if she could come out and educate us. And she brought her team from Poison Free Malibu, including her husband, Joel Schulman, along with some other folks from her team, as well as someone from the National Park Service, and a woman by the name of Dr. Laurel Series. She actually wasn't a doctor at the time. She was a doctoral student who was doing research on the impact of rodenticides throughout the Santa Monica Mountains. And actually, I forgot to mention, just for those of you, it's hard to see, but for those of you who aren't familiar with Pepperdine, we're located in Malibu, and we're surrounded by the Santa Monica Mountains. So we are really the definition of being at the urban wildland interface. And so it's critically important in terms of why the work that we've done and what we learned was really so beneficial. So here we have the issue, the problem. And actually, this guy makes it really hard to believe this even is a problem because he looks so adorable right there. I should have had like a really big rat or something. But the issue are these bait boxes. And the issue is, and I know one of the things that we're talking about today is you've got your specific target species. In this instance, it's, the rodents themselves. And then you've got your non-target species and how trying to go after the target species ends up with non-target species being impacted. So the reason that these rodenticides, and that's what's in the upper left there, the reason that these rodenticides are a problem are because rats are pretty smart. And so they're not going to go and they're not going to gorge themselves on these rodenticides and immediately drop dead. They're going to eat some of them. They're going to go out into the ecosystem. And of course, life goes on. And these rodenticides, and by the way, all of these pictures that I'm about to show you, the next series of pictures come from Poison Free Malibu. So these rodenticides are ingested by the rodents, and then they go out into nature, and nature takes its course. Predator species eat them, more predator species eat those predator species, and they bioaccumulate up into the local ecosystem. And what we found is really profound. Not what I've found, what I've learned is really profound. What we found is that essentially over 90% of predator species within the Santa Monica Mountains, really just focusing on Southern California, but within the Santa Monica Mountains are impacted. So when we look at cougars, mountain lions, that's actually been increasing as well. I think that was a theme that we heard today. Everything's going up and up and up. In 2011, all of the mountain lions that were tested within the Santa Monica Mountains, it's about 79% of them had rodenticides in their system. Now in 2016, it's up to 90% of them, 93% of them. We have bobcats that are at 92%, coyotes are at 83%, raptors and owls, depending on where they are, anywhere from 80 to 90%. And the really incredible thing, and this is so disturbing, and it talks about the level of time and the amount of time it takes for these to have an impact, is they can have some of these species, when they are tested, they don't just have one, they'll have 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of poisons within their system. And so there can be direct effects in terms of them directly dying, or there can be indirect effects. So I have a couple of images here. So P22, for those of you who are familiar with P22, he's the famous mountain lion that made his way from the Santa Monica Mountains over to Griffiths Park. He actually crossed the 101 and the 405. Really incredible, and now he's stuck there. So he's got a lot of things that he's dealing with, but in addition, now also rodenticide. So this is a before picture of him, and this is an after picture of him. And I don't know what the time difference was here, but essentially it degrades the immune system over and over, and he ended up with mange. And so that comes directly from that. But that's actually a good news situation, because sometimes they don't make it as well. And I think recently there have been 3 mountain lions in the near term that have been killed by rodenticide. So this one was within 9 months, a healthy mountain lion you see here, 9 months later dead, had 5 different rodenticides in his system. And then finally, here we have, this is the same, in both of these, it's the same animal. And here we have, up on the left there, we have a bobcat, healthy as can be, and then here we have them later near death, resulting from, again, the repeated rodenticide exposure. So this was the really disturbing stuff that I learned from Poison Free Malibu and their team. And so we immediately knew that something had to happen, and particularly because of our location within the Santa Monica Mountains. Again, as I said, we are nestled right there. So what we're doing is going to be impacted. We have these species all over our campus, but I don't want to paint it so Pollyanna as soon as we knew, we immediately resolved it. It was a process that we went through to figure out how are we going to eliminate these, because of course the first thing that came up, perhaps a little bit ironically, is the safety. The safety of our students. What do we do about them? And so we went through about a year-long process. But I really want to give credit to our director of facilities and our facilities team generally for being open to this, for being receptive to this, as well as to our administration, for really taking the leap here. And so a huge aspect of that was that stakeholder engagement. So it wasn't just a mandate of we're not using these anymore and we're done, but it was really getting to the point of understanding the why behind what we were doing. I also think it was coming from a place of patience and empathy. It's really easy for me as someone who's engaged in sustainability to say, of course we should do this, but I'm not the one that's responsible for making sure that there's not rodents on campus. And so it was having empathy and patience as we went through that process. So ultimately, though, we put out an RFP and we transitioned over from one vendor to another vendor, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, transitioned from one vendor to another vendor and completely eliminated the use of rodenticides on campus. So what did we do? The biggest thing that we did, rodents go where there's food. So when there's not food, rodents go away. And so what we did, the first thing is that we patched holes on campus. So any place that rodents can get into a building, that's a food source for them. So we patched holes on campus. We also covered trash. And I've got up there food, it is to them, that's food. And by the way, our facilities team would be really upset if I let you think this is a picture from our campus. It's not. We would never have let it get like this, but we did have open dumpsters. They did not have lids on them. And so we went from not this bad, but we went from open to closed, and that's made a big difference. We're also, some of the exterior receptacles around campus, that aren't dumpsters, we're looking at putting lids on those as well, to further reduce those food sources. And then the third piece is, and by the way, this is what a typical bait box looks like. The third piece that we did is that we replaced bait boxes with live traps. And so those live traps, you might think, well, how do they go? Why do they go into the live traps? We actually don't use bait. What we do is we take advantage of the fact that rodents, because they are prey, they are not just going to be scurrying about in the open. They like to go in places where they're protected. And so you put it in locations and they'll actually go directly into that. Now, I'll just share a couple of learning lessons here. One is that the live traps that we're using right now, they look just like bait boxes. And so I think Keon or someone on her team actually came up and said, after we had implemented the program, I see bait boxes on your campus. What's going on? And they weren't bait boxes. If you get really close and you read the little tag there where you're supposed to mark off the poison that's being used, there was nothing marked, but because there was no rat poisons in them. But of course, that really leads to an impact on your credibility, because people are thinking that you're doing something that you're saying you're not. And if I'm not there to be able to tell the story, that's going to be a problem. And so I would suggest that folks not do that. The other thing I might suggest is you might not even need the traps at all. And that's actually where we're at right now. And the reason that I say that is because we've eliminated those food sources. We've eliminated those attractants. We don't have either food or bait. Thank you. We don't have either food or bait bringing them in. And so as a result, literally, as we look at the data, and we're pulling this, I'm pointing to Emily, who's our sustainability coordinator at Pepperdine. As we were pulling the data recently, I mean, the incidence of rats that we're catching, and by the way, we do a catch and release of the ones that are caught, there's like none of them. It's very rare. And so we're paying for a program that we, pretty much don't even need. Oh, but by the way, we're also saving, even if we continue to utilize the traps, $15,000 per year. So if you even just put aside the impacts to the ecosystem and just look from a purely cost and financial perspective, we've been benefited with this. Now, going back to what we've been talking about today in terms of supporting biodiversity, we previously had a program where we were at odds with our surrounding ecosystem, right? I mean, we were putting something out into the ecosystem that was damaging it. It was even damaging specifically birds of prey. And so with our second phase, first we had the operational stop on the use of those rodenticides, but then the second phase was how do we actually partner with those in our ecosystem? How do we use them beneficially? The good news is that birds of prey, well, the bad news for them when we were using rodenticides was that birds of prey eat rodents. The good news is when we're not using them is that birds of prey eat rodents. And so we actually implemented raptor perches throughout our campus. And so this has been a really incredible program. And what's so fantastic, and those dots are, there's actually 9 of them, but one of them we found to be really ineffective. But we used our biology professors as well as our students to figure out where should these go. And this is my favorite slide of the whole thing here. And so we had our biology students not only help us with locating them, but also help us with understanding what works and what doesn't work. And so we've got some hawks here. We've got an owl up there. This is actually one of my favorites. He's kind of looking at the raptor perch as well as the ocean off in the distance there. And so this is part of the study that was done by the students about which ones worked and which ones didn't work. And here, what the conclusions that I would share are that we found that the perch needs to be far from another perching site. As you saw, if he's got a tree to sit in, he's going to sit on that. He's not going to utilize the perch. If you've got known raptor nesting sites nearby, those are fantastic. If you can locate near a body of water, an open area so that they can scan for the rodents, a field or a hillside. And then also I mentioned there was one that just wasn't used at all. That one was not only near a road, but it was actually at eye level, so they're not going to want to be in that location. Now, I skipped over this one. I did that intentionally. We are actually working right now to place owl boxes, nesting boxes around campus, but we've actually run into a little bit of a complication, which is that as you have those owl boxes around campus, wherever you have a nest, which is a fantastic thing, you're not going to be able to be doing construction. So it's just one of those complexities that we have to figure out exactly where do we locate these. But the good news is when we have the information, we have all the stakeholders engaged in wanting the same goal, you're able to find solutions. And then I know I'm running out of time here. What I wanted to say is in addition to the amazing benefit in and of itself of the rodenticide program is, believe it or not, the rodenticide program directly resulted in this really amazing health of this completely organically managed soccer field that we have at Pepperdine University. And the reason for that is by establishing the credibility that we could have facilities maintenance occurring on campus without the use of these conventional products. That's what we established with rodenticides. We didn't need them. We were able to transition into a commitment to roll out an organic land management program. And now this soccer field is the first of our recreational fields on campus, recreational and athletic fields that's managed completely organically. And so that's just a really wonderful thing. And then the final thing that I would say is I was also asked, again, from a practitioner's perspective, to give, some advice as if you're going to be starting one of these programs, or if you're someone who's going to be a vendor who's reaching out to someone to start the program. I mentioned earlier how Keon came from a place of not attack, not judgment, working collaboratively. But I also think it's important to ensure sure that if you have an organization that you're approaching, that they have ownership, they have accountability, they have those small successes. And certainly it would be the best thing possible for someone to just overnight be able to get rid of something. But sometimes we have to have a little bit of empathy and patience and work with them to get to the proper end result. So anyway, thank you for your time. And it's just been a pleasure to be here with all of you.